مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هل اقتربت سيطرة دونالد ترامب على الحزب الجمهوري من نهايتها؟ مع أن بعض المرشحين المدعومين من ترامب فازوا في معظم الحملات الانتخابية التمهيدية، إلا أن البعض الآخر خسرها. من بين الخاسرين مرشحون بارزون في ولاية جورجيا، ومرشح مجلس ولاية بنسلفانيا لمجلس الشيوخ، والمدعوم من ترامب، والذي أوشك على الخسارة أيضا. هل وصل تطرف ترامب إلى الحزب الذي كان قد أعاد تشكيله على صورته، أم أن الناخبين سئموا من سماع استوانا سرقة جو بايدن للانتخابات بعد 18 شهرا على بعد ولايته؟ على الجانب الآخر، هل نال جو بايدن نصيبه من المدح على نجاحاته، أم اللوم فقط على فشله؟ ما فشل فيه بايدن معروف جدا بدءا من أفغانستان وانتهاء بالتضخم، ولكن نجاحاته بارزة ومهمة كالدفاع عن أوكرانيا بدون ضحايا أمريكيين وإبقاء البطالة في أمريكا في حدها الأدنى. هذه هي الأسئلة التي طرحناها ستلعب دورا كبيرا في تحديد نتائج الانتخابات التشريعية الأمريكية بعد أقل من 6 أشهر. يسرني أن أستقبل صحفيين كبيرين هما أليكس غانجيتانو وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. This week, we're going to start with the horrific shooting in Texas that left 21 dead in an elementary school. Mass shootings regrettably happen with numbing frequency in our country. Lots of thoughts, lots of prayers, lots of outrage, lots of promises, very little action. Is this one going to be different? Are we going to see any action from Congress? I'm delighted to welcome Steve Clemens and Alex Gangitano to explain this issue and to talk more broadly about the state of American politics. Let's start with this. Steve, any action?
Well, all I'll say, Rob, is that this is one of the toughest issues to discuss because you and I have discussed this before as we've seen horrific incidents in theaters, in churches, in grocery store parking lots. We've seen racism and white supremacy firing up against some mad person who comes in and murders a lot of people. And as you just said, down in Uvalde, Texas, we've had 19 young children die, 2 teachers. And so I'll say what I've said before is, regrettably, despite this horror that we're looking at staring in its face, we're not likely to see any change because there is not a consensus in this country that the horror we're seeing is caused by guns. Those that want to change the vector of these horrible incidents want to try and control guns, who has access to them, what kind of guns people can buy. We have a constitutional amendment that protects one's right to carry and have arms. And there's a lot of debate about what that means. But on the right, as we've seen, the right says this is a mental health problem, not a gun problem. And until that paralysis ends at some point, and sadly, this isn't the moment it's going to happen, we're going to see tragedy after tragedy. I'll just add one element. We had 693 mass killings in the United States last year alone. That meant a mass killing is characterized as 4 or more victims. And so we do have an epidemic problem, unlike any other place in the world. And yet we still don't have a consensus on what to do.
And so, Alex, when you look at Capitol Hill, when you look at the White House, do you see any movement, any change, any dynamic?
Yeah, it's a good question. President Biden ran on being one of the most pro gun violence prevention presidents in history. And he, talks emotionally about the issue, and he talks emotionally about loss a lot. And he has taken steps to do things like eliminating ghost guns, which are kits that you order to your home to make a gun in home. And he's, doing kind of, I think the White House wouldn't call it small steps, but he's doing little things on an executive level that he can. He has kind of punted to Congress and said, if they send a bill to me, of course, something needs to happen on gun control, but it's the ball's in their court. And so the president, I think, is looking to the Senate to really figure out a bipartisan step here. Something that came up in conversations around the White House is, the issue of should you be 21 years old to buy a gun? The shooter in Texas was 18 with an assault weapon. So that's something that I think the Senate could get some sort of bipartisan consensus on. And then, of course, there's an assault weapon ban. President Clinton was able to, under him, pass an assault weapon ban, which has since expired. And that's really what has been used consistently in these mass shootings in the US. The president has been calling for an assault weapon ban for months, I think, since he became president. And there's been no action on that. And so that's something that I think Democrats are kind of pushing on, but losing hope that Republicans would be able to join them on that effort. So unfortunately, it's looking grim about what the Senate can actually do. Of course, a bill could pass the Democratic-led House, but it really comes down to what kind of consensus can happen in the Senate.
And Steve, the most recent outrage occurred in the heart of a red state. Does that change the dynamic in any way? Are legislators from red states taking a look in the mirror on this?
No. I mean, look, the easiest element to pass is, Alex was said, after another horrific accident, Sandy Hook Elementary School, in which so many young children were shot. Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Pat Toomey, a Democrat and a Republican, and Manchin as a conservative Democrat, tried to work together to bring forward a background checks bill that was the lowest minimum threshold that you would think would be necessary in kind of moving gun control or gun regulations forward, and they failed at that time. So the question is something like that possible again? Alex may be right, maybe so, but I think this is going to become another debate about constitutional rights and the Second Amendment of the Constitution. And in my view, it just does not, it's not going to add up into something that is going to create real change.
All right, so let's expand the conversation. I want to talk now a bit about the politics of primaries, what we're learning from Americans who have been voting around the country, state by state, internal party primaries to choose candidates that will then compete in November in the legislative elections that we have here every 2 years. Let's first focus on the Republicans. Alex, former President Donald Trump, is he retaining his grip on the party? What do recent election results show?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the president is kind of almost in a stage right now that we can kind of reevaluate what his standing is in the Republican Party. He has such a stronghold over especially Republicans in Congress. These House Republicans especially have been so aligned with him and using his endorsements as such a powerful thing. But the president also had a big loss in Georgia recently with the governor election. Former Senator Perdue was defeated by Governor Brian Kemp, which is kind of someone who Trump has aligned himself against and is kind of an arch nemesis of the president within the Republican Party. So big losses like that for the president, I think, shows that maybe his stronghold isn't as powerful as it was. And I think as these states continue to come out with their primary elections, we'll see more and more of where the alignment is. And if a Trump endorsement in a Republican primary means an immediate victory in a red state, which of course then could mean a general election victory as well, or if his name and his power has kind of diminished a bit as he's been out of office, or as Washington has had to answer big questions like this issue of gun control, and things that kind of will show if Republicans would vote in a more moderate way or not once they come to Congress.
And Steve, when you look at it, is Georgia, the Trump defeat in Georgia, an outlier or a harbinger of things to come?
I think it's, a bit of both. I mean, I think it's a harbinger that he's not nearly as strong in these states as some might have thought. And that's going to create some sense that he's beatable and that alternative wings are possible.
So I'm hearing you say that no matter who wins, a pro-Trump or anti-Trump Republican, on almost all the other issues,
they're going to be the same.
They're going to be this. Is that your view as well, Alex?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the abortion is a huge one, a big example of that. Getting any Republican and red state to change their views on if Roe v. Wade should be overturned that's a very, very hard thing to accomplish. And I think there's so many cultural issues right now, as Steve mentioned, that really just are a stronghold of the Republican Party. And so I think anybody who wins in this primary is going into the general election with these issues and not going to budge on them. And that's regardless, as we were saying, of if Trump is in your corner or not.
And are we likely to see, Alex, some of these anti-Trump winners make up with Trump, or Trump make up with them by November? Is there going to be unity? Is Brian Kemp going to hug Donald Trump sometime in October?
Trump has it's very interesting to watch his relationship with various people in the Republican Party. It can be a roller coaster of, who he likes one day and who he doesn't like, and who's forgiven him or allowed him to be on stage with him, or who, distances themselves from him. And I think that the more likely that we've seen over the past few years is that Republicans tend to kind of crawl back into Trump's corner after maybe having a little disagreement with him or whatever, and will then invite him to some campaign event and let him speak or accept his endorsement. So that's typically the track that we've seen. But I think a good example is actually down in Virginia with the governor election. The Republican governor was actually pretty good about distancing himself from Trump once the general election was happening. I think, and that obviously boded well for him. So that was a interesting kind of example of using Trump in the primary, kind of aligning with him in order to win a tough Republican primary. And then when the general election comes along in a state that might not be such a Republican stronghold, kind of distancing yourself a little bit and seeing how that turns out for people. So, but it's always interesting to see who accepts Trump's endorsement after having, a tiff with him previously.
And Steve, before we go to the Democrats after the break, your prediction about perhaps the most vocal anti-Trump legislator in Congress, Liz Cheney, does she win her primary, or does she lose out to the Trump-endorsed candidate in Wyoming?
Sadly, I think she's going to probably lose that primary the way the numbers look right now and they're going. But that doesn't mean that she's not primed for larger national office and aspirations. She can lose in that seat and still become someone who is grabbed one way or another by both more moderate Republicans and independents out there for some sort of alternative race. If you buy the line that she and also Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger have, who are saying put country first, they're of the view that the Republican Party is critically wounded right now and is not itself. And so the question is, how does that look down the road? So, I do think that Liz Cheney is likely to lose her race. I don't think she thinks that, but I do. And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't harm her chances at all necessarily running for higher office down the road.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to turn our focus to the Democrats, what we're learning from them, and how Joe Biden is weathering the storm just 6 months before the November election. In just a moment. Banning books is wrong, unless it's a how-to manual to build a biological weapon or an instruction guide for pedophilia. I believe we should never ban books. Debate them, denounce them, critique them, but never ban them. Sadly, school systems across America are now in a frenzy to ban novels that discuss what some believe to be provocative or uncomfortable themes. But when age appropriate, isn't education about being provoked out of one's comfort zone? And isn't today's provocative and uncomfortable literature often just tomorrow's mainstream award-winning books? With thanks to Barnes & Noble booksellers, here is a list of the top banned and challenged books in America. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, Mouse by Art Spiegelman, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, 1984 by George Orwell, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, Animal Farm, also by George Orwell, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. They're not all my favorite books by any stretch, and they're certainly not all my favorite authors. But many of these are among the finest pieces of literature of their and any generation. Ban them. I hope my kids read each and every one. Again, my guests today include Alex Gangitano. Alex is White House reporter at The Hill, a special newspaper covering Capitol Hill and Washington politics. There, she was previously the Herd on the Hill and the lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, she was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call. And joining us is Steve Clemons. Steve recently joined the startup Semaphore, where he is the founding editor-at-large. Previously, he was at The Hill, The Atlantic, New America Foundation, and the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. All right, Alex, let's take a look at the Democrats. So far, when you look at their primaries around the country, generally, who's doing better? Progressives on the left or centrists in the middle?
Hi there. Thanks again for having me. So I think, the Democrats are in a really tough position going into November, of course, from the general election perspective. But what we're seeing in primaries is an interesting kind of refocusing of the Democratic Party, and how progressives who have been so vocal. I think that the outside perspective would think that they have the stronghold of the Democratic Party, and that's where all Democrats are aligned, are doing in the primaries. And I think more moderates are also doing well as well. So it's kind of an interesting recalibration, I guess, of where the alignment is in the party and who kind of is looking more towards a Joe Biden Democrat versus, an Ocasio-Cortez Democrat. And so it's been interesting to see how these come in and how the president's endorsement or support for certain people has been playing out in the States.
And Steve, when you look at this, do you see any pattern emerging?
Well, I think Alex has it right that it's a mixed bag out there, and depending on the composite of the district they're running in, you're going to have some candidates that are going to win that are in more progressive districts versus those that are more moderate, where independents play a big role. That said, there seems to be more passion and frustration on the progressive side, real frustration with the fact that they were not able to get the social infrastructure bill, a lot of the climate legislation they care about, child care tax credits, et cetera, that were part of the Build Back Better legislation that the Biden administration seems to have fumbled. And very big frustration with President Biden on things like climate, that despite the major crisis that we have in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the rise of gas prices out there, that he hasn't stuck more to renewables and non-fossil fuel agenda. So there are these frustrations in the left. And I also think they're not all from the Biden administration. Some of them are from the Supreme Court leak that the woman's right to choose to govern her own decisions about her body and birth and abortion is likely to fall. And that important key mark legislation that that Alex Gangitano talked about earlier, I think is another driving force of real anger and frustration on the left.
All right. Regrettably, we're going to have to stop it there. I want to thank you very much, Steve Clemens and Alex Gangitano, for joining me this week on Dachel Washington. Take care. If you are a loyal watcher of Dachel Washington, you know that I am a fan of the two-party system we have in America, in which there is a center-left party, the Democrats, that emphasizes the government's role in helping smooth the excesses of capitalism, guarantee equal opportunity for all, and ensure that the state assists the less fortunate. And there's a center-right party, the Republicans, that emphasizes the principles of individual rights, individual responsibility, and limited as to guarantee both. Our political pendulum has often swung for lots of reasons, but in recent decades, we generally have held to those political options. Then came Donald Trump to shake things up, replacing traditional conservatism, reverence for tradition, limited government, individual rights and responsibilities, with something in his image. Trump captured the party and rode a wave of populist anger to an improbable victory in 2016. And despite his loss 4 years later, a loss many of his supporters still refused to accept, he kept a large part of the party in his thrall. As results from recent primary elections came in, there are signs, some faint, some less so, that reality may be coming to an end, at least in some states, on some issues, in some parts of the country. We saw that clearly in Georgia, and more faintly in places as different as Pennsylvania, Idaho, and Nebraska. If that happens, it will be a good thing. I don't believe that is a partisan comment. After all, I want a robust conservative party and a robust liberal party, jousting in the tournament of public opinion to determine the best path forward for America on any particular issue, or compromising with each other to take the best, or at least bad idea they have to reach a consensus approach. Trumpism, however, is not about compromise and cooperation. It is the politics of anger. And while it is sometimes useful to get angry about injustice, inequality, and incompetence, for example, anger is not a useful political strategy to run a country. Nor, for that matter, is slavish adherence to a hard left agenda that presupposes big spending government is the answer to all problems. But that's the stuff of another essay. So let the voting continue, with more primaries in states like Alabama and Wyoming to determine whether the Republican candidate in November will be a traditional conservative or a Trump acolyte. Of special interest to watch will be the fate of Liz Cheney, an arch conservative from one of America's most well-known conservative families, who was perhaps Trump's most vocal Republican critic on Capitol Hill, both voting for impeachment and serving on the January 6th investigatory committee that Republican House leadership is still boycotting. If she survives a populist challenger virtually handpicked by Trump, it will be the sign that the grand old party is still alive and kicking. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن معركة السيطرة على مجلس الشيوخ، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.